Live Fit Podcast, episode 90. What is the most dangerous kind of sugar?
Welcome to the Live Fit Podcast with Glenn Johnson, your resource for all things that contribute to good health. You will hear expert advice and interviews with leading authorities on fitness, food, fat loss, mindset, and the mind-body connection. You will find show notes, articles, and health programs at livefitpodcast.com.
Yes, it is time once again for the Live Fit Podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Johnson. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I welcome you, and I appreciate you lending me your ear. This is episode 90, Sugar Part 2, the most dangerous kind of sugar. Since this is kind of a long episode, I'm not going to talk too long. I want to go straight into the housekeeping and please ask everybody to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And if you care about anybody, please forward the show to them and let them have a taste of it. You can also help support the show by going on to patreon.com/livefitpodcast. You can find a link to that, a link to leaving me a voicemail, and of course, the show notes for this and every episode on livefitpodcast.com. Now, let's get right on to it and find out what the most dangerous kind of sugar is and why. Sugar is the new smoking, don't you know? Sugar is everywhere. Many say it's responsible for the obesity epidemic. Others want to segregate the different types of sugar and blame one type, such as high fructose corn syrup, over another, like the pure white cane sugar. Yet researchers keep showing that sugar is at least partially responsible for the onset of type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic liver disease, obesity, cardiovascular disease, neuropathy, and more. Can this sweet substance really be killing us slowly and painfully? Can something that takes away the pain when given to babies and helps the medicine go down and is found naturally in fruits and other foods, and it takes away the bitterness and it makes eating fun, can this really be the scourge of our current health condition? Well, let's talk about it a little bit. I'm going to give you a really brief history on sugar. Humans have been processing sugar for about 8,000 years. In fact, they found it so valuable, it's been a commodity that's been worth more than gold many times. About 80% of our current sugar comes from a grass plant that looks a lot like corn or bamboo, the sugar cane. It's grown in the tropics and it requires a great deal of energy to harvest and process it. Only about 10% of this plant can be turned into sugar though, and the processing of this pure white substance that we put on our table and stir into our coffee takes about 56 steps. I'm going to post a video on how sugar is made on my show notes page at livefitpodcast.com, and you can see for yourself what it takes to turn a cane of sugar into that white crystalline substance that we scoop out with a spoon or make sugar cubes out of. If you watch this, I want you to take note at how many less steps it takes to make raw sugar, or the sugar in the raw that a lot of people like, that they think is so healthy. I love that stuff. So I said about 80% of our sugar comes from the cane. About 20%, the rest of it, comes from a beet, which looks kind of like a potato, kind of like a turnip. It's a really pretty large, ugly root plant, but it's about 16 to 18% sugar, not nearly as fibrous, doesn't take as much energy to extract and get more sugar out of it. So why do we only get 20% of our sugar from it? Not quite sure about that one, but it's not really pertinent to this show, so we'll just gloss over it, pretend I didn't say anything about it. Sugar and the acceptance of sugar as a valuable ingredient in our food supply began in the mid-70s when a charismatic doctor named Ansel Keys, using a flimsy research study and funding from a large industry, shifted our beliefs. In 1972, another doctor named John Yudkin published a book called Pure, White, and Deadly: Problem of Sugar, in which he explained that sugar is at least partially responsible for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. Well, he was met with a lot of criticism from the sugar industry, as you can imagine. Ansel Keys jumped on that, and between the two of them, they defamed Yudkin and pretty much drowned him out of existence. Keys was promoting the notion that fat causes the health problems of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. So these guys were on the same side trying to figure out what caused those health problems. They just came to different conclusions. Now, Keys had the backing of a huge industry behind him in America. Yudkin did not have the backing of a huge industry because fats come from many different sources, where foods that are low in fat or no fat almost always have sugar in them. So that's why the sugar industry was more than happy to jump on his bandwagon and help things along. So, as I just said, the sugar industry sided with Keys. They hired a huge public relations company that furthered their own interests. This PR company worked really, really hard to make the sugar industry look really beautiful and make Yudkin look really horrible. They called his research into question and his methods, and is actually, we know this now, it was the other way around. Keys was the one who did shoddy research and was funded directly by the sugar companies. Now that fat was the villain, it was game on for any food or beverage that did not contain fat, or that could be made without fat or with less fat. This covers sugars in all its varieties, starches, fruits, juices, vegetables, and even lean proteins. 40 years later, we are fatter and have more health problems than ever before. Many people are still not aware that this experiment failed miserably, and they still believe, or at least they want to believe, that fat makes a person fat, and that sugar, since it is pure and white and delicious and natural, can't be bad for them. And I was one of those people. I grew up, I was starting to learn about nutrition in the mid-70s, and I totally fell into the fat makes you fat and sugar ain't so bad mentality. And, it worked okay for me. I was pretty active, but I don't exactly feel foolish because the wool was pulled over so many people's eyes for so long, and there really wasn't a lot of research out there disputing it. I think the main thing is nobody knew it was an experiment. Sugar is the new smoking, and it is damaging the body. The problem with sugar is so deep and complicated. To say that it is the new smoking really is painting a pretty picture. It's not nearly as simple as the whole smoking issue we had with health. That was pretty easy comparatively to point a smoking gun, so to speak, at tobacco and nicotine as being the cause of many of these health effects, especially lung cancer. Sugar is not so far, and it might be a while before sugar becomes as clear to be the smoking gun for some of these health effects that we have. But, the interesting thing is the sugar industry is acting now just like the tobacco industry did in the 70s, 80s, and even in the 90s. There were two recent documentaries about sugar. One was called Sugar Coated and the other, That Sugar Film, that directly compared the behavior of the sugar industry now with that of the tobacco industry 30 and 40 years ago. Does anybody remember when the heads of tobacco stood up in front of a grand jury under oath and said that tobacco is not addictive? Well, they were trying to keep their industry afloat, and that's exactly what the sugar industry is doing now. The sugar industry wants to protect itself. That seems pretty natural. Well, sugar's natural too, and shoot, for that matter, so is tobacco, and arsenic, and heroin, and radiation. But we live in a capitalistic society, and sugar has a lot of money behind it. And there are many, 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 many businesses that rely on sugar for their livelihood. I'm not going to give examples of all the foods that have added sugar in them or that are made primarily with sugar, but just walk through a grocery store. You'll see that 75 to 80% of the products in there contain added sugar or high levels of sugar, such as fruit juice. But like cigarettes, sugar is addicting. They've proven this. Sugar lights up the same area of your brain that nicotine and heroin and cocaine and alcohol does. Is sugar a poison? Is it an epidemic, or is it a gift? If you believe in good and evil, God and the devil, then it is pretty easy to recognize that sugar is a gift from Satan. Sugar lures us into its sweet flavor and harmless appearance. Sugar is used to make food fun and increase its flavor. Sugar is used to neutralize bitter taste. And what would the colorful candy industry be without it? Sugar is given to children for Pete's sake. But is sugar really all that innocent? No, I don't think so. And it's damaging our bodies and their bodies. Slowly but surely, sugar takes hold of our lives and degrades our health. All calories are not created equal. To easily demonstrate this, I'm going to have you imagine a portion of 100 calories of the following: chicken breast, table sugar, spinach, chocolate, and orange juice. They're going to be in different sizes, of course. But now I ask you, which one will satisfy your body the longest? Well, the chicken and the spinach will definitely keep you from feeling hungry for a longer period of time. It will fuel your body better and will prevent you from having a sugar crash. Which one of those would be the worst for you? Either the orange juice or the sugar, the granulated sugar. One of those is going to give you some energy right away, but then in about 10 minutes, you're going to have that sugar crash, and then you're going to be hungry again. In fact, famished. In fact, hangry. That is why people become hangry, because their blood sugar drops. The problem in our Western society, at least our Western society, is that most people tend to eat foods and beverages that contain sugar. Sugar is very hard to avoid unless you're making it all yourself from scratch. And even then, you're probably getting added sugar into your diet. If you use canned or processed tomatoes, a salad dressing, sauces, all these things generally have sugar added to them. You could say they don't have that much sugar in them, right? A can of tomatoes, how much sugar does it have? Well, first of all, you might be surprised at how much is in there. Every tomato product, unless it's very specifically made without sugar and says no sugar added, but any product that has tomato in it almost always has sugar. That in itself is pretty surprising. Tomato sauce and salsa. I had some salsa today that was as sweet as ice cream. I chucked it. I did not eat it. It was not, no bueno, no bueno. But you know what? All the sugar you eat, it does add up. The U.S. government has not set any standards on the amount of sugar that a person should consume or the limit of how much they can consume, other than to say, don't consume too much. Well, they don't say how much is too much. And you know, without these official limitations set by the government, many people, subconsciously anyways, might feel that since there is no limit given, then there really is no limit. Either they make up their own limit or they figure, well, it can't be all that bad since Big Brother hasn't told me it's all that bad. But the World Health Organization recommends that adults eat no more than 12 teaspoons or 48 grams of free sugar a day. Free sugar? What's that? They define free sugar as sugars added to foods by the manufacturer, a cook, or the consumer, plus sugars naturally present in things like honey and syrups and fruit juices and fruit concentrates. Let me tell you what free sugar is not. It is not the sugar found in a whole fruit, a vegetable, or milk, such as a banana or an orange or an apple or even a sweet potato or a carrot. Those are not considered free sugar. Those are totally cool. Now, in 2015, the World Health Organization upgraded their recommendation from the 12 teaspoons down to 6. I say upgraded because they've improved things. So they've halved it. They now say you should not have more than 6 teaspoons or 24 grams of sugar a day. Now, how many grams of sugar is in a can of soda? Despite the common attitude, ingesting high amounts of sugar is more dangerous for children than it is for adults. I'm going to let that sink in a little bit for you. Sugar is more dangerous for children than adults. Sugar is definitely behind the obesity epidemic, the childhood obesity epidemic, and it leads to other life-shortening and debilitating diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, poor self-esteem, learning disabilities, emotional instability, and a poor quality of life. Pretty much every processed food has sugar in it. Sugar is found pretty much everywhere that's been processed, in a can, if it's frozen, in a bag, in a box, pretty much everything in the middle of the store. I know it's pretty easy to realize that there's sugar in sweet things like cookies and cakes and ice cream and sodas, but what most people don't realize is that it's in the savory foods and in lunch meat and in bread. Pretty much most processed foods, like I just said, have added sugar. And once again, tomatoes. I implore you, read the ingredients, not just the food label, not just the nutrition label, but the actual ingredients. Sugar goes by many names. Many of them end in the suffix "ose," O-S-E, or syrup or sugar, but I have a list on my show notes page. I think there's about 56 different names for sugar. They're different types of sugar, mind you. They're not just trying to make things up to fool you, but they are sugar. And all in all, on a whole, sugar is sugar. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Sugar is sugar. There is no healthy sugar. Fruit juices are still considered by many to be healthy. However, they are processed and they contain very high amounts of sugar. Take a look at my infographic I have on my show notes page. It'll show you the difference between what most people call a healthy drink and a not healthy drink. And some of the healthy drinks have more sugar than the not so healthy drinks. I'm sure you wouldn't give your child a Red Bull, would you? But would you give them a Jamba Juice? You're giving them way more sugar if you are. Yeah, there's more things in Red Bull than sugar, but I just wanted to illustrate that point. Now, true, juice is natural, but it's a lot of sugar. And in fact, picture a glass of orange juice. How many oranges do you think it would take to fill that glass? 4, 5, 6, depending on the size of the oranges and how juicy they were, and the size of the glass, of course. But would you sit down and eat, let's say, 5 oranges at one time? I would, but I'm kind of a fruit freak in that sense. In fact, one morning, sitting on the Central Coast on a beautiful garden-like backyard, had nothing to do except sit there and just enjoy the weather. There was an orange tree with ripe oranges. Over about a 3-hour span of sitting there, I ate a dozen oranges. Wow, what a great way to start the day. Now, I spread it out over the 3 hours, and I did not juice these oranges. I ate the whole thing. Now, the big difference here is that I ate the entire orange, not the peel, but I got a lot of fiber with that orange, and that sugar did not absorb into my bloodstream nearly as quickly as it would have had I drank it. Now, I could have juiced all 12 of those oranges and drank it down in just a few minutes, but boy, that would have shot my blood sugar up tremendously high and fast, and then I would have crashed and been asleep for 2 hours shortly after that. But as it was, eating those oranges just like I did, it was great. It was a really, really pleasant way to start the day. But unless you're going to eat the whole orange, I say skip the juice. I've been trying to wean my kids off of juice for quite a while. It really took me a while to accept the fact that fruit juice is not a very healthy drink. That took me a long time to accept that. But now that I have, and I haven't had fruit juice in quite a while, maybe a sip here or there, but not a whole glass of it. Let's look at glucose versus fructose. Now, based on what you've heard so far, what do you think is the most dangerous kind of sugar? Most people I talk to say high fructose corn syrup is the cause of obesity and other ailments. These people often opt for the cane sugar or honey or even agave as a healthy alternative. Would you believe that agave is the least healthy of all the sugars? Honey's not great either. Sorry, dear. But as I already alluded, cane sugar is not so great either. It's about as natural as high fructose corn syrup. Maple syrup is closer to natural. Agave, it's about as close to natural as maple syrup. Honey, there you go. That's about as natural as it gets. Honey does not require any processing to be the honey that you would recognize. It usually is processed a little bit, but it doesn't have to be. But that doesn't make it healthy or even less harmful. Honey is still pretty darn bad for you. I'm not saying don't use it. I just want you to be educated. As I discussed in the last episode, 89, in part 1 of the sugar series, there are many different types of sugars, and they all come in different names, usually based on their molecular structure. So I'm going to go into that for a little bit. If you remember, I said that all carbohydrates break down eventually to glucose. So we're going to have this little discussion about glucose versus fructose, because fructose is another monosaccharide. It's another single molecule sugar, but it is metabolized differently and in a different place than glucose. Glucose makes up the majority of corn syrup. It is half of sucrose or table sugar, and it is in all the other sugars that you ingest. Glucose has very little sweetness to it. I went to Australia and I had a jar of glucose and I tasted it. I was expecting it to be super sweet, like honey. It was so far from the opposite. It was about as sweet as licking a piece of paper. It was really incredible how unsweet it was. It wasn't bad tasting, it just wasn't very sweet. But this is where fructose comes in, because fructose is almost always married to glucose. It doesn't have to be, but it generally is. Corn syrup, for example, has a little bit of fructose in it. Honey is glucose and fructose. Table sugar is 50% fructose, 50% glucose. In fact, molecule for molecule, they're bonded to each other, and there's one of each. Each are bonded to each other. Fructose, of course, is the main sugar in fruit, but there's also glucose in there as well. Now, all these carbohydrates, whether they're complex or simple, will break down to glucose eventually. Even fructose will break down into glucose. Remember those oses I told you about? High fructose corn syrup, on the other hand, is corn syrup with an enzyme added to it, so it changes some of the glucose into a fructose. Now, there's different ratios of high fructose corn syrup. There's a 40, a 55, and a 90. So that's how much fructose compared to glucose is in there. But what we're used to seeing and drinking and eating is 55% fructose, 45% glucose. So that's almost the same as sucrose. 5% more fructose, that's it. So it's a little teeny tiny bit sweeter. I don't know that you'd even notice the difference on your tongue. Now, high fructose corn syrup came into our food supply in the mid-70s. Bingo. Are you catching a theme here? The 70s was really a time for nutrition. 70s was an interesting era, wasn't it? Now, high fructose corn syrup has a lot of benefits for the food and beverage industry. It dissolves in water much more easily than sugar does. It doesn't crystallize in an acidic environment. The water, when it dissolves into water, it doesn't have to be hot. It'll dissolve into cold water much more easily. It helps preserve food. It helps brown foods. So think of bread and cookies and things. It also helps make those cookies chewy, if you like the chewy kind of cookies. Oh, and did I mention that high fructose corn syrup is cheap? In fact, it's about 1/3 the cost of cane sugar. Why do you suppose that is? Politics. Back to those interesting 70s again. The U.S. government placed a tariff on sugarcane. They also provided a pretty sweet, pun intended, subsidy on corn production. This made corn syrup and high fructose corn syrup much less expensive to create. In fact, cane sugar, the price of cane sugar is artificially high, and the price of corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, is artificially low. Well, this, as you can imagine, made high fructose corn syrup an irresistible sweetener for the food and beverage industry. The cost and all those other benefits I named, I'm sure there are more, but those are the ones that I know of offhand. So let's get back to carbohydrates on the molecular level. Now, when these carbohydrates are ingested, they're broken down into a single molecule, a monosaccharide. The three monosaccharides are galactose, fructose, and glucose. When glucose is absorbed, it enters the bloodstream and travels around the body looking for any cells that are open to it. If a cell is open, glucose goes into the mitochondria, turns into energy, ATP, and this takes place all over the entire body, especially the brain. The brain only feeds off of glucose. Now, these cells will open up to the glucose when insulin is present. Insulin is present when blood glucose levels approach their upper limit. When fructose and galactose are absorbed, they of course enter the bloodstream as well, but they are locked into the liver to be metabolized. The liver is the only place those two are metabolized. Galactose breaks down pretty easily into glucose. Fructose, on the other hand, will break down to glucose. It also breaks down into lactic acid, also break down to triglycerides and VLDL cholesterol, very low density lipoproteins. So we have those in the liver and even floating around in our bloodstream. Something else that fructose does when it's in the body is it does not trigger ghrelin or insulin. Fructose does not trigger ghrelin or insulin. Ghrelin is a hormone that kind of adds up how many calories you're ingesting, and it tells your brain when you've had enough. All right, we're getting there. We're starting to fill up. All right, we've had enough calories now. Stop eating. When you're consuming fructose, those calories are not added. Now, it also doesn't tell insulin to release because fructose doesn't need insulin to absorb into the cells because it doesn't. It goes into the liver and it doesn't need insulin at all. So all that is a little bit separate. Now what it will do is it will release glucose later on, but it doesn't at the time. So insulin stays down when you eat fructose, and that was one of the foods that diabetics consume for their sweetness because it tastes sweet, but it doesn't raise insulin levels. Fructose also breaks down into lactic acid. So a lot of lactic acid is going to be filling the body when fructose is ingested. The above, what I just mentioned, pertains to natural fructose. Fructose that is bound to glucose has to split apart. It's found naturally in fruit, in roots, in other foods and plants naturally, even honey and maple syrup. The fructose and glucose are bound together. Now, that bonding they have to be cleaved apart. So that's going to slow down the absorption. So if you intake sucrose, for example, the bond between the glucose and the fructose has to be cleaved apart so they can go their own separate ways. There's two different doorways through the gut wall to enter the bloodstream. One for glucose, one for fructose. It's kind of like men's and women's restrooms. In this case, I don't know which is the man or the woman, but you get the idea. Oh, I have a fun fact for you, speaking of glucose and fructose. Now, I just mentioned that when you eat sucrose, the fructose goes into the liver, and some of it is turned into glucose, which then floats around in the bloodstream looking for cells that need it. Some of it will go to the prostate. The prostate will then turn it back into fructose to put it into the semen to feed the sperm. Hey, fun factoid for you. All right, now let's get on to the heart of the matter. When high fructose corn syrup is consumed, these two sugar molecules, fructose and glucose, are not attached to each other. What that means is those two molecules shoot right through those doorways and get right into the bloodstream much more quickly because they don't need to undress before they get in there. Now, I am not a bandwagoner. It took me quite a long time to jump on the blame train about high fructose corn syrup being responsible for all the nation's ills. However, there are many causes for suspicion about the health effects of HFCS. One thing, there's impurities such as mercury and other substances that are not normally tested for. And the fact that the two molecules are not bonded together causes a little bit of concern. When a person consumes mass quantities of fructose in any form, it overloads the ability of the liver to process it properly. In that case, it turns it to fat. That fat builds up into the liver, causes these small little fat pockets, which really are the precursors to cirrhosis. Now, cirrhosis of the liver is generally caused by a virus or alcohol, but fatty liver disease can be caused by fructose when consumed in high quantities over a long period of time. How high? How long? Undetermined. There's also indicators that sugar is responsible for inflammation and neuropathy. The reason HFCS is being blamed for causing all these health problems is, one, people really like to blame something. There's a problem, there must be a cause. What is that cause? We don't know. Let's look for it. HFCS came on the market at the same time the obesity epidemic really started ramping up. Cause and effect, we don't yet know, but there certainly are a lot of indicators pointing in that direction. This debate will continue until there is enough quality research to prove without a doubt that sugar or fructose or HFCS is to blame. Aside from everything I just said, that's all really bad. But my biggest gripe in all of this is the fact that the U.S. government is subsidizing the production of corn and HFCS. This is causing our people, our country, kids and adults, the young, the middle-aged, the old, to become weaker and fatter and ill and dependent, addicted. Can you imagine? What if the government was giving away free cigarettes at elementary schools? Would you have a problem with that? I sure would. I would have a problem if they were giving them sugary drinks too. Like I said, I am not an HFCS hating bandwagoner, but as time goes on and more evidence comes out pointing in that direction, it's time to really start taking a good, serious look. And maybe it's all conjecture and anecdotal evidence, and HFCS is not any better than cane sugar. But the main problem is it's everywhere. Because it is such a useful product for food and beverage, processed foods, it's everywhere. So whether that particular sweetener is the problem or just the fact that sugar is everywhere is the problem, and changing our palate to only tolerate sweet foods, that's a pretty big problem. So let me break it down, give you the really quick gist. We are consuming more sugar now than ever before. Most of that sugar is coming from HFCS. High fructose corn syrup is always found in very poor quality foods. High amounts of fructose damages your health, causes fatty liver disease, increases your bad cholesterol, increases triglycerides, increases your risk for cardiovascular disease, and increases your risk for diabetes. So, what is the most dangerous kind of sugar? By the sound of it, you're probably saying HFCS or perhaps fructose. Well, not quite. My answer is, drumroll please, liquid sugar. Yeah, liquid sugar, because it absorbs so much more quickly than a solid sugar does. And also, so back up to that first sentence, liquid sugar almost always contains fructose. Now, whether this fructose is from HFCS or from sucrose or from honey may or may not matter much, but high levels of fructose entering your blood, entering your liver very quickly is definitely damaging, no matter where it comes from. I suppose you want to know what you can do about it. Well, good. I have a few tips right here. The first thing you want to do is wean yourself away from sweet things, especially sweet drinks, fruit juices, sodas, and yes, even those liquids that are hiding your alcohol. Drink water. Water is awesome. In fact, I'm having some right now. Water is fantastic. It's my favorite drink. But I do understand if you're used to the strong flavor of a soda, a juice, some of those other things you might be drinking, lemonade, sweet coffee, sweet tea, water doesn't taste very good. So what I recommend is you add something to it to give it a little flavor. I like adding lemon or lime to it. That's my favorite, but still, that doesn't have as much flavor as you may be used to. So what you can do if you want to wean yourself off soda is do it gradually. Add water to your glass of soda. Instead of drinking a full soda, drink 90% of your soda and fill the glass the rest of the way with water. Then the next week, drink 80% soda, 20% water, and keep doing that until you're down to almost nothing. Maybe you can get away with just having 10% of your glass of water containing soda or juice. You know, at that amount, it doesn't really matter. It's not that harmful. 10 or 20% of a pint glass of orange juice, lemonade, soda, it's not going to be harmful. I also really want you to avoid using artificial sweeteners or artificially sweetened beverages because they don't do anything to help you change your taste away from sweets. If you're used to drinking sweet, you're gonna only be satisfied with drinking sweets. If you're gonna get off sugar, you gotta get off sugar. You have to establish a new palate. In fact, I'm working on a program right now that will help you do just that, so stand by. Now finally, tell your friends, spread the word. Most importantly, keep your kids off the stuff. If cavities and increasing the risk of heart disease and diabetes and obesity aren't big enough problems for you to keep your kids and yourself and your friends away from sugar, think of the habits the kids are starting, that they're developing, that they're going to want to change when they're middle-aged and having all these health problems. Think of the habits you're starting them on now that they're going to want to change later, that they're going to struggle with and have a hard time doing that. You probably know it's not easy to change a habit, especially one that you really love, like, that ice cold glass of Pepsi or, whatever it might be. If you really love it, you really love it. And some yahoo like me tells you you shouldn't drink it because it's bad for you. Well, you put on a frowny face, don't you? Well, how about if you never develop that habit to really enjoy that ice cold glass of Pepsi? Think of how much better your body would be off now and your mind, because you don't have to drop a habit that you really love. Give the kids a chance. That's what I'm saying. If you wouldn't give a cigarette to a kid, don't give him a sweet drink. Let's talk about Michael Pollan. I love this guy. Who doesn't? Really, is anybody out there not like this guy? He's great. He makes so much sense. Years ago, I read his book, Food Rules, and I hid it from my clients. I felt that if they read this book and followed it, then I'd be out of work. Well, fortunately, humans are very strange creatures because knowing something and doing something are not always the same. In fact, quite often they're not. So I've picked out 7 of his food rules from his book that I found appropriate for this subject. Number 5, avoid foods that have some form of sugar listed among the top 3 ingredients. Number 9, avoid food products with the wordoid light or the terms low-fat or non-fat in their names. 11, avoid foods you see advertised on television. Yes, absolutely. 35, eat sweet foods as you find them in nature, i.e. fruit, sweet potatoes, etc. 39, eat all the junk food you want as long as you make it yourself. And I doubt you'll be adding HFCS. 56, limit your snacks to unprocessed plant foods. And my favorite, number 60, treat treats as treats. That's fun to say, isn't it? Treat treats as treats. The bottom line, the sugar industry and all those that use sugar want to protect themselves until there is hard, irrefutable evidence that sugar is the direct cause to any of these serious health issues. The sugar and corn industry will keep on humming along and cramming it down your throats with advertisements and gimmicks and bright colors and fun and all these things that are going to make eating and drinking sugar irresistible. You cannot wait for government intervention because it may never happen, and it certainly isn't going to happen very soon. This is going to have to come from you. Each one of you is going to have to do your part. If you care about your health and the health of your children, take a stand and keep the sweets, especially the liquid sweets, out of your house, out of your car, and out of your and their bodies. The faster sugar gets into your bloodstream, the worse it is for you. The more sugar that gets into your bloodstream, the worse it is for you. Here's my number 1 takeaway. The more sweets you consume, the more you want. Ergo, the less you consume, the less you want. Stay strong on this stance. And before you know it, you will be sugar-free and feeling great. If you want some more tips, see episode 30, The Sugar Battle, where my wife and I get on and we talk about sugar pushers and how you can stay away from sugar in a sugar-filled world. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Live Fit Podcast. Please subscribe and share with someone you care about. Read show notes, articles, resources, and learn more about our weight management programs at livefitpodcast.com. Once again, thanks for listening, and always remember to live fit.